Welcome back to Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston. Today we're diving into a question that's going to make some people uncomfortable. What if billionaires aren't just greedy, but disordered? When most people hear hoarding, they picture houses so stuffed with newspapers, broken appliances, and random junk that you literally can't walk through the front door. Maybe you've seen those reality shows where professional organizers in hazmat suits shovel through decades of accumulated debris while family members sob in the driveway. It's dramatic television, but it's also a real psychiatric condition that affects millions of people. What gets interesting from a psychological perspective is that hoarding isn't really about the stuff. It's about the inability to let go, the emotional attachment to possessions, and the deep psychological distress that comes from trying to discard anything. And when you start thinking about it that way, as a pattern of compulsive accumulation and pathological resistance to release, suddenly billionaires, oligarchs, and tech moguls start looking less like successful entrepreneurs and more like a socially sanctioned subset of hoarders. They don't pile up newspapers in their living rooms, they pile up billions of dollars, political influence, data, patents, housing, and sometimes entire countries. And society not only tolerates this behavior, it celebrates it, rewards it, and builds entire economic systems around protecting billionaires' right to keep accumulating indefinitely. So today, we're going to explore what hoarding actually is from a clinical perspective, why it developed as an adaptive human behavior, and what happens when those same psychological patterns scale up from cluttered apartments to global power structures. We'll look at the personality traits that drive compulsive accumulation, examine how our culture enables and rewards pathological hoarding when it happens at the billionaire level, and ask the uncomfortable question: if we intervene when someone's hoarding makes their house unlivable, what should we do when billionaire hoarding makes entire societies unstable? Let's start with what hoarding actually is. For decades, researchers classified hoarding as a subset of obsessive-compulsive disorder. That made intuitive sense. People with OCD have intrusive thoughts and compulsive behaviors, and hoarding certainly looks compulsive. But as scientists dug deeper into the psychology, they realized hoarding has its own distinct patterns. The current clinical understanding recognizes hoarding as a separate disorder with unique neurological signatures and treatment challenges. People who hoard aren't just messy or lazy or unable to throw things away. They have fundamental differences in how their brains process attachment, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Think of it this way. When a typical person looks at an old sweater that they haven't worn in 5 years, they see fabric that's taking up closet space. When someone with hoarding disorder looks at the same sweater, they see distinct memories, an identity, security, and potential. Discarding it doesn't feel like cleaning up, it feels like losing a piece of themselves, abandoning future possibilities, or violating some deep sense of responsibility to the object. This isn't about being sentimental or nostalgic. It's about profound cognitive and emotional differences in how possessions are perceived and valued. Research shows that people with hoarding disorder have difficulty with information processing, distorted beliefs about the meaning and importance of their possessions, and intense distress when faced with discarding decisions. What makes hoarding so stubborn as a psychological condition is that it often begins in adolescence and it tends to run in families. There are clear genetic and developmental components. People with hoarding disorder frequently struggle with self-control, emotional regulation, and attachment patterns that develop early in life. Traditional OCD medications don't work well for treating hoarding, and even cognitive behavioral therapy shows mixed results because many people with the condition have poor insight into how their behavior is affecting their lives. The important part that connects to our broader discussion is that hoarding isn't purely pathological. There are evolutionary reasons why human brains developed these attachment and accumulation patterns. From an evolutionary perspective, hoarding was incredibly adaptive behavior. If you lived in an environment where resources were scarce and unpredictable, stockpiling everything you could find might literally be the difference between surviving the winter or dying of starvation. Imagine you're an early human. Food spoils, tools break, weather changes, and predators attack. The emotional drive to hold on to resources and to feel genuine distress at the idea of throwing away something that might be useful later wasn't irrational. It was survival programming. The people who couldn't bear to waste anything were the ones whose descendants lived to pass on those genes. The psychological attachment to possessions that we now call pathological may have once been protective. That anxiety that you feel when someone suggests throwing away your collection of potentially useful containers, that's your ancient brain trying to keep you alive in a world of scarcity. The problem is that those same neural pathways are now operating in a world of unprecedented abundance. The survival instinct to never throw away anything useful becomes maladapted when you can replace almost any object quickly and cheaply. This gets really interesting when the thing being hoarded isn't mammoth meat or firewood, but abstract resources like money, data, or political power. Those ancient hoarding instincts didn't just disappear, they scaled up. And when they scale up to the level of billionaires and global elites, the consequences shift from cluttered living rooms to destabilized societies. The psychological patterns that drive someone to fill their house with newspapers are remarkably similar to the patterns that drive someone to accumulate billions of dollars that they can never possibly spend. Both involve emotional attachment to resources, difficulty with discarding or redistributing, and deep anxiety about future scarcity despite current abundance. Recent anthropological research has started exploring the connections between traditional hoarding and financial hoarding. The same people who struggle to throw away physical objects often show different patience patterns for money versus consumables. They're more willing to wait for monetary rewards to grow, to let wealth accumulate indefinitely, but they feel urgency about acquiring and keeping physical items. This distinction is crucial for understanding billionaire psychology. Physical hoarding has natural limits because objects take up space, decay over time, and create obvious problems when they accumulate beyond reasonable levels. But money is abstract, frictionless, and infinitely accumulable. It doesn't rot, it doesn't create health hazards, and it doesn't force you out of your home. For someone with hoarding tendencies, money is the perfect object of attachment. It never forces the painful discarding decisions that physical possessions eventually demand. You can accumulate billions of dollars without your neighbors calling adult protective services or your family staging an intervention. And the kicker is that society rewards financial hoarding. The same behaviors that we recognize as pathological when they involve physical objects are celebrated as genius, ambition, and success when they involve wealth accumulation. We don't see Jeff Bezos' net worth as a manifestation of compulsive hoarding. We see it as evidence of business acumen. But looking from a psychological perspective, the patterns are strikingly similar. The difficulty with letting go, the emotional attachment to accumulation, the resistance to redistribution, the anxiety about future scarcity despite massive current abundance, these are all textbook hoarding behaviors scaled up to a global level. So, what kind of person develops these extreme hoarding patterns? The research on hoarding disorder reveals some consistent personality profiles that become very interesting when you start thinking about billionaires and oligarchs. People with hoarding disorder tend to score higher on neuroticism. They experience more anxiety, emotional instability, and stress. And they score lower on conscientiousness. They struggle with organization, follow-through, and impulse control. That's already a volatile psychological combination. High anxiety paired with poor self-regulation. Now layer narcissism onto that foundation. Research shows clear connections between narcissistic personality traits and compulsive acquisition behaviors. We dug deeper into this on a previous episode about billionaire brains, but let's talk a little about it now. Narcissism involves distorted self-concepts, grandiose thinking, and difficulty with empathy, all traits that can amplify hoarding tendencies. When you believe you're fundamentally superior to other people, it becomes easier to justify keeping resources that others might need. Narcissistic hoarders don't just accumulate objects for money or security, they accumulate them as extensions of their identity, proof of their specialness, and as tools for maintaining their sense of superiority. The possessions become part of a grandiose self-image, and they can't tolerate reduction or redistribution. Think about the tech moguls and billionaire entrepreneurs who dominate our cultural landscape. The personality traits that help them succeed in competitive industries, grandiosity, ruthless focus, detachment from ordinary human concerns, overlap uncomfortably with the traits we see in hoarding disorder. When someone like Elon Musk talks about needing to colonize Mars or acquires Twitter to, quote, save free speech, when Jeff Bezos insists on stockpiling not just wealth, but data, logistics networks, and global infrastructures, the line between vision and compulsion starts to blur. Are they driven by genuine innovation and social benefit, or by the same psychological inability to let go that makes a hoarder keep 40 years of National Geographic magazines? From the outside, it's often impossible to tell the difference. But the behavioral patterns, the endless accumulation, the resistance to redistribution, the anxiety about losing control over resources, they're all remarkably consistent. The hoarding psychology doesn't stop at money. It extends to power, influence, information, and even governance itself. Political scientists have documented how authoritarian leaders exhibit classic hoarding patterns in their approach to power consolidation. Dictators and oligarchs stockpile authority at the expense of democratic institutions, creating the same kind of systemic dysfunction that physical hoarders create in their homes. They can't bear to delegate real power, so they resist any reduction in their control, and they experience genuine distress when faced with the possibility of losing influence. The psychological attachment to power becomes so strong that they're willing to destabilize entire countries rather than allow for normal transitions of authority. We see this pattern playing out in real time with tech elites that hoard data, intellectual property, and innovation itself. Companies buy competitors not to expand or improve services, but to eliminate threats to their market dominance. They acquire patents to prevent others from developing alternative technologies. They collect user data far beyond what they could ever analyze or monetize, simply because having it seems safer than not having it. This is hoarding at the level of human progress. Instead of allowing innovation to flow freely through markets and communities, a small number of individuals and corporations accumulate the tools of technological advancement and keep them locked away from potential competitors. The same psychological inability to let go that makes someone keep broken electronics just in case scales up to keeping breakthrough technologies off the market to protect existing profit streams. And just like individual hoarding, this systemic hoarding creates serious problems for everyone else. When too much wealth, power, and innovation gets concentrated in too few hands, the entire system becomes unstable and dysfunctional. We talked a bit earlier about the psychology being really twisted, that when an individual hoarder fills their house with junk, we recognize it as a pathology and intervene. But when billionaires exhibit the same patterns, we celebrate them. Creating magazine covers featuring their latest acquisitions, or building business schools around studying their strategies, or inviting them to give TED Talks about innovation and entrepreneurship. Part of this cultural blindness comes from philanthropy, which functions as a kind of reputation laundering system for extreme wealth hoarding. Billionaires give away small fractions of their accumulated resources, often with strings attached that maintain their control, and society treats this as evidence of their benevolence rather than their pathology. It's like praising a hoarder for donating a few boxes to Goodwill while ignoring the fact that their house is still uninhabitable. Another part comes from our cultural narratives about success and ambition. The American dream teaches us that accumulation equals achievement, that more is always better, and that the ability to acquire resources demonstrates personal worth. We tell rags to riches stories in the United States that frame compulsive wealth accumulation as heroic rather than concerning. Media coverage reinforces these distortions by treating billionaire behavior as inherently newsworthy and admirable. Every rocket launch, art purchase, and social media acquisition gets covered as if these individuals are public benefactors, rather than people exhibiting concerning patterns of compulsive accumulation and control. Meanwhile, the actual psychology driving these behaviors remains invisible. We don't see the anxiety, compulsion, the inability to find satisfaction through normal redistribution and share. We don't recognize the pathological attachment patterns or the distorted thinking that makes someone believe they need more resources than entire nations consume. This cultural enabling is dangerous because it creates social permission for pathological behavior. When society celebrates and rewards extreme hoarding, it removes the natural feedback mechanisms that might otherwise encourage more balanced relationships with resources and power. If we took billionaire hoarding seriously as a psychological and social problem, what would intervention look like? When we treat individual hoarders, we use cognitive behavioral therapy to help them develop healthier thinking patterns around possessions. We create structured plans for gradual reduction of accumulated items, and we build support systems that encourage sustainable changes in behavior. At the societal level, we already have most of the tools we need for similar interventions. Progressive taxation functions like assisted decision-making for people who can't voluntarily redistribute their accumulated wealth. Wealth caps would provide clear boundaries for healthy accumulation levels, similar to how we set limits for hoarders about how much stuff they can reasonably keep. Campaign finance reform would break the cycle of using accumulated resources to acquire more political power, addressing the compulsive aspect of the hoarding pattern. Antitrust enforcement would function like the organized cleanout interventions that families sometimes stage for severe hoarders. When companies accumulate too much market power or control over innovation, breaking them up creates space for healthier economic ecosystems to develop. The essential reframe here is that these policies aren't punishment, they're harm reduction. Justice therapy for individual hoarders isn't about cruelty or taking away someone's belongings out of spite. Systemic interventions for wealth hoarding would be about creating more livable social environments for everyone. We already have extensive research showing that extreme wealth concentration undermines political equality, distorts democratic institutions, and creates economic instability at scale. These aren't abstract problems. They're evidence that accumulating resources beyond certain levels becomes actively harmful to social functioning, just like accumulated possessions beyond certain levels becomes harmful to individual functioning. The challenge is that just as individual hoarders often have poor insight into how their behavior affects themselves and others, billionaire hoarders seem genuinely unable to recognize the systemic damage their accumulation patterns cause. They experience policy proposals for wealth redistribution as threats to their identity and security, triggering the same psychological distress that hoarders feel when asked to throw away their possessions. Fortunately, people aren't waiting for policy changes to address these problems. Cultural resistance is already emerging that reframes billionaire behavior in more psychologically accurate ways. Satirical activism has proven effective at this reframing work. Groups like the old Billionaires for Bush street theater troupe used parodies and performance to highlight the absurdity of extreme wealth accumulation. Current social media culture, especially among younger generations, regularly mocks tech moguls and oligarchs for their compulsive acquisition of rockets, yachts, social media platforms, and political influence. This satirical approach does exactly what clinical psychology does. It takes behaviors that have been normalized or celebrated and relabels them as concerning, problematic, or pathological. Memes about billionaire space races aren't just jokes, they're a cultural diagnosis, recognizing compulsive behavior patterns and calling them out as such. However, revisit our past episode on the memification of fascism to learn some guardrails about how to do this. Generational attitudes toward wealth hoarding are shifting significantly. Younger people are much more likely to view extreme wealth accumulation as evidence of moral failure or psychological dysfunction rather than success or achievement. They're less impressed by displays of accumulated resources and more concerned about the systemic effects of wealth concentration. These cultural changes are creating the social condition necessary for more systematic intervention. When enough people recognize pathological behavior as pathological rather than admirable, it becomes politically possible to implement the kinds of policies that could actually address wealth hoarding at scale. One of the core challenges to treating any hoarding disorder is helping people develop alternative sources of security and identity that don't depend on accumulation. For individual hoarders, this might mean building social connections, developing new hobbies, or finding ways to feel valuable that don't require keeping every potentially useful object. For billionaire hoarders, the parallel intervention might involve cultural changes that redefine success, achievement, and security in ways that don't require endless accumulation of resources. Instead of celebrating people for how much wealth they can accumulate, we could celebrate them for how much value they create for others, how effectively they solve important problems, or how well they contribute to social flourishing. And this isn't just feel-good rhetoric, it's practical psychology. People with hoarding tendencies need alternative ways to meet their underlying emotional needs. If we want billionaires to develop healthier relationships with wealth and power, we need to offer them other paths to the security, identity, and social recognition they're seeking through accumulation. Some entrepreneurs and business leaders have already started moving in this direction, focusing on sustainable business practices, employee ownership models, and wealth redistribution as part of their core identity rather than as an afterthought. These examples suggest that it's possible for people with significant resources to find satisfaction and purpose through sharing rather than hoarding. But we can see, especially in the United States, that some of the other oligarchs and tech bros and billionaires and political people in power are pushing back against this trend as hard as they can, fighting against DEI initiatives and other sharing initiatives at companies. These individual examples also aren't enough to address the systemic problems created by wealth concentration. We need cultural and policy changes that make healthier patterns of resource distribution the default rather than the exception, and we need cultural and policy changes that make the pushback against redistribution on a systemic level unacceptable. Ultimately, the question of whether billionaire hoarding is a form of pathology isn't just academic. It has real consequences for how democratic societies function. When too much wealth and power gets concentrated in too few hands, it undermines the basic premise of democratic equality, that every person's voice and interests matter equally in shaping social decisions. Research on wealth concentration consistently shows that extreme inequality distorts political processes, reduces social mobility, and creates instability that affects everyone, even the billionaires. These aren't abstract problems. They're evidence that certain levels of resource accumulation become actively harmful to social functioning. If we can recognize that individual hoarding becomes pathological when it makes homes unlivable, we should be able to recognize that wealth hoarding becomes pathological when it makes society unlivable. These same principles that guide intervention for individual hoarders, protecting health, safety, and functioning, should apply to systemic interventions for wealth hoarding. This doesn't mean that all wealth accumulation is pathological or that successful entrepreneurs are automatically disordered. It means that there are levels of accumulation that cross the line from healthy achievement into compulsive hoarding, and that societies have legitimate interest in preventing those pathological patterns from destabilizing democratic institutions. So, where does all this leave us? Hoarding disorder teaches us that adaptive instincts can become destructive when they spiral beyond healthy limits. At the individual level, this creates cluttered homes that become unsafe to live in. At the billionaire level, it creates cluttered political and economic systems that become unsafe for everyone. The parallel's not perfect, but it's illuminating. Both individual hoarders and billionaire hoarders exhibit similar psychological patterns: difficulty with letting go, emotional attachment to accumulated resources, anxiety about future scarcity despite present abundance, and resistance to outside intervention. Both create problems that extend far beyond their immediate environment, and both require intervention that addresses underlying psychological patterns while also managing the practical consequences of accumulated dysfunction. The difference is that we already have established frameworks for recognizing and treating individual hoarding, but we're still learning how to address hoarding that happens at the scale of nations and global systems. We know what healthy relationships with possessions look like for individuals, but we're still figuring out what healthy relationships with wealth and power could look like for societies. What we do know is that the current patterns aren't sustainable. When a small number of people accumulate resources far beyond what they could ever personally use, while millions of others struggle to meet basic needs, something is fundamentally broken in how we organize social life. Whether we call it hoarding, inequality, oligarchy, or plutocracy, the result is the same: systems that work well for a few people with compulsive accumulation patterns and poorly for everyone else. If hoarding in a house makes it unsafe to live in, what happens when hoarding reaches the scale of nations? We're all finding out in real time. And just as we've learned to intervene when individual hoarding threatens health and safety, we must learn to intervene when systemic hoarding threatens democracy and social stability. The good news is that we already have most of the tools we need. The question is whether we'll develop the collective will to use them, or whether we'll continue celebrating pathological accumulation patterns until they make our shared social home as unlivable as any cluttered house on a reality TV show. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of PsyberSpace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, signing off and telling you stay curious and pay attention to what's happening with people who are hoarding and accumulating things around you to the detriment of others. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a week, and send this to a friend if you think they'd enjoy it.